afternoon, and thank you for joining us on this lousy day. My name is Tara, and I work here at the museum. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to acknowledge our generous donors who have helped to make this lecture series possible. The museum receives funding from the New Jersey Historical Commission for its general operating budget, as well as for this lecture series. We have also received funding from the Gilda Lehrman Institute of American History, the Library of America, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. I hope after our talk you will take a moment to complete a survey of your thoughts on today's lecture. Okay, so now today's historian is Professor Lisa Mastrangelo from Centenary University, where she teaches rhetoric, writing, and composition, and serves as the vice president for the Coalition of Women Scholars in the History of Composition and Rhetoric. So please join me in welcoming her to the museum.
Thank you all for coming on such a foul day. As Tara said, I want to start with the caveat that I am not a history historian. I am a historian of rhetoric and composition. So mainly what I look at are people's rhetorical practices, and my area of expertise is the progressive era. So of course, World War I falls within this. This is a story that starts before the story, as many of them do. And I also have to apologize in advance because I've told a few of you I'm very in love with my subjects. So I'm very excited that I actually get to talk to you about them. So the story that many of you are familiar with is, well, I don't think most of us are familiar with any of women's participation in World War I. The story that we're familiar with is women's participation in World War II, where we knew them to be nurses and ambulance drivers and code breakers and things like that. But this history is actually set up in World War I. Some of you who have attended the previous lectures have heard how hard Wilson worked to keep us out of the war. And this affects the women who are involved as well. So he sort of sets himself, well, he very much sets himself up to have a very big problem with the women. A problem that I think many politicians feel that they still have. So the story that I started to find as I began to unravel this was one where there was some definite competition between two groups of women, but they were both defined in the same way. And so even these two popular songs recognize these two sides, the peace activists versus the women who called themselves the Preparedness movement. So part of Wilson's problem is the peace movement. And at the point where we enter the war, there are between 40 and 60 documented peace organizations, many of them run by women. The largest is the Women's Peace Party, which later becomes the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Some of you are maybe members of that. It still exists today. And then you'll see the difference between these two groups of women, and I'll talk more about this as I go on. The peace movement women are very much independent groups, whereas the preparedness movement organizations are very much linked to organizations that already exist, largely in an attempt to control them better than they were able to control the peace movement. So women's participation from a rhetorical, women's participation in both of these movements, and I just love these pictures given our recent parades and demonstrations of both the Preparedness Parade from 1916 and earlier the Peace Parade from 1914, both of which were in New York City. But they are very, very active, producing documents in particular. So they give speeches, they distribute flyers, they create brochures, they have parades, they have luncheons, they sign petitions. Does any of this sound familiar? They write newspaper and magazine editorials and articles, they have rallies. So both groups are extremely active for their sides of the cause, if you will. So the interesting thing here is what they create is what rhetoricians call an ideograph. So an ideograph is a word that becomes imbued with meaning in a particular social and historical location. So in this case, they start talking about these people in terms of motherhood, and they start using motherhood as a way to talk about the war. And it's really interesting because many of the key women in both of these movements don't actually have children. They're childless. So it's very metaphorical. And it's very much, if you look at the research, a lot of the research that I was finding, and this was one of the reasons that this got interesting to me, was they talked about them all in terms of this notion of essentialist motherhood. And I started to see some real differences in the ways that these women were using this terminology. So the peace movement very much defines motherhood as essentialist. Women are the keepers of the hearth and the home, the moral fabric of our society. And they have this innate duty to protect the country and its sons from war, right? Well, this gets to be a problem because once we enter the war, the other side that I started to see, I labeled patriotic motherhood. And this is completely my term that I've made up, but I've published it, so now I think it's real. And this is women as supporters of the country and its troops by encouraging men to go to war and supporting the men who are already at the war. And this is where we get this sort of war to end all wars ideology that comes through. And so this shifts, this motherhood idea shifts as our time frame moves on. So those who are against the war cite it as a reason to keep their children out of it, and those who are supporting war or who really have the more realistic sense that we're about to go into this, cite it as a reason for supporting and giving care, and also having pride for those who have entered it. This creates some conflicts, as I'll talk about as we go on. And really, many of the significant activists don't have kids. And so this, like I said, is a very metaphorical mother of the nation kind of terminology that both they are using and is put on them by government officials, by journalists, and things like that. So this is one of my favorite pictures ever. It says, "Real patriots keep cool." But you start to see this motherhood imagery and this use of the motherhood ideograph show up right from the very beginning. So this is the Women's Peace Party. They are one of the earliest organized peace groups, and they have, we're not really sure, but they have over 40,000 members right away when World War I first begins. And they have an entire day-long meeting on January 10th of 1915. And can everybody see the quote? I don't want to just read my slides. Okay. So the mother of the country rhetoric occurs all day long in their speeches. So this is the first speech of the day, and one of the later speeches of the day is given by Janet Richards, who is a speaker representing the National Conference on Catholic Charities. Her speech reflects this as well. She says, I love this, "Women are constructive, not destructive, and you know that. Woman conserves the home. Woman protects the child. Woman does not lead in great battles. You do not find her ready to march forward in serried ranks to murder." So it's really strong language that these women are using in this protective motherhood rhetoric. So I don't think you can see this. This is from the Anti-Enlistment League. This is one of the flyers that they put out. And in it, just before that sort of dark paragraph, it says, "Women, refuse your consent to the enlistment of your men. The true courage is to stand for the right and refuse to kill." So it's, again, that women don't kill kind of rhetoric. It's I think it's much more powerful than we kind of usually think of women of this time period being. And especially with the earlier speech, given that she's coming from the Catholic Conference, I think it's a very interesting use of language on her part. These are women on the Ford peace ship. Some of you are aware that Henry Ford had funded a ship to go overseas to attempt to negotiate peace. They are the U.S. delegation to the International Congress of Women for a Permanent Peace. This is really substantial activism on their part and them organizing, and they kept saying to the government, you have to send a delegation to try to keep us out of this. And the government says, fine, you can go if you can fund it. So they get Henry Ford, and he funds it, which was kind of a surprise to everybody. But when they get to Europe, the negotiations that they're attempting to have for peace, many people will not see them because they are women. Many people will not see them because they're not a U.S., they're an official government delegation. The good part to this is that they do see firsthand the damage that is being done in Europe. And they come back and they use that rhetorically to tell stories, basically, and say, you have not seen what we have seen. And if you had seen what we had seen, you might be thinking differently. Rosika Schwimmer, who was a Hungarian who was here, who was also very active in the peace movement, she reminded her listeners that, like the mothers of Europe, they were voiceless to prevent some incident that might bring for your children what has happened to our children. So again, this protect your children kind of rhetoric appears. So Wilson has encouraged this behavior up until this point because, he runs on this ticket of keeping us out of the war. He wants the support of these groups of women. And then he has a little PR problem. It's called the war. And he doesn't know what to do about them. Now, many of these peace organizations, these 40 to 60 peace organizations, many of them fold immediately. They see, that if their rhetorical strategy was to try to keep us out of the war, it's done. Some of them, though, particularly the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, they continue on. As I said, they're still there today. And so he's trying to figure out really how to shut them down. So he uses, in part, he uses media, particularly movies. He uses publications. He uses some of the same strategies that they were using, but he also uses the women and this motherhood rhetoric. So some of these uniforms are actually in the Smithsonian. There's a collection of women's World War I uniforms in the Smithsonian. One of the groups that crops up right away is the women's section of the Navy League. And again, these are all organizations that are attached to already existing organizations because Wilson's people, in particular George Creel, who's in charge of the Committee for Public Information, they're concerned about better controlling sort of what these women do and how they behave, and really what they're saying and what their public image is. So this is their pledge that they are required to take. And again, you can see this idea of making the home a center of American ideals and patriotism. Here's where we shift now into this patriotic motherhood. And endeavoring to teach the children in my care to cherish and revere our country, its history, and to uphold its honor and fair repute to the generations. So it's this idea of continuing American patriotism for the children, real or metaphorical, who are under your care. So pay attention to these uniforms and the tent behind them. There we go. So one of the things the Navy League does, and I found this so interesting, was they said to the women, okay, you want to be active? We'll set up camps for you. So while it was pitched to motherhood, this is the really interesting part. The people who can go to these camps don't have children. or their children are grown. They have to pay their own way, so including the cost of the uniforms, the cost of room and board while they're there, which is tense. And so they are clearly upper class enough that they can leave their homes and they can afford the uniforms and they can afford to pay to get there, and to participate in these camps. There are some women who go overseas. We do know that about 10,000 women went overseas as nurses at this point in time. But the women's Navy League camps are really, really interesting. They have elective courses in elementary heliography, which is photo making, and they largely use that to make large-scale maps by piecing photos together. Cipher study, code work, and plain and wireless telegraphy. These women, some of these women, will actually be called on, particularly the younger ones who went here as sort of, early 20s, not yet married, don't have kids yet. They'll be called on in World War II because they actually have some of the skills that the U.S. military forces are going to need in World War II on a much larger scale. Our impact at this point is fairly small. Some women do go overseas as yeomen, which are essentially secretarial positions within embedded units. And some go to established canteens, and some do, from their education in these camps, go overseas to do signal work. But again, very, very small number. The other part that I find very interesting is this second half. Other courses included elementary hygiene, home care of the sick, first aid to the injured, instruction in preparing diets for the sick, and lessons in knitting socks and mufflers, rolling bandages, and plain sewing. I'm sure if I had said this to my grandmother, who was born in 1936, she would want to know why these women did not already know those things. So again, I think there's definitely a class issue here. But these women went in some pretty substantial numbers to the Navy League camps. And again, it's a way of, there's sort of two sides to it. It's a way for the government to say, you want to be active, you want to do something, here's something for you to do. And people really, of course, did want to respond to the war. On the other hand, they can say to them, right, you sort of go over here and we'll control carefully what you do. Because, again, they were concerned about them being too vocal against the war. So the other group that they joined, and this is another group that I'm interested in, and I'm giving a talk in April about the 4 Minutemen, are the 4 Minutemen women. So the 4 Minutemen are developed, I know. The 4 Minutemen come out of the Council of Defense. They're government-sponsored volunteers. Does anybody know where the 4 minutes comes from? No? Okay, so, this is a point in time where you can't tweet out and say, hey, there's an issue coming and we need you to go to a rally right now, right? There's no mass media at this point. Radio is still not broadcasting news privately in homes. You don't have internet, you don't have computers, you don't have televisions. And so Wilson is concerned about getting his message out to people. The 4 Minutemen are based on, of course, the Revolutionary War Minutemen, ready at a moment's notice to fight for their country. The 4 minutes is the amount of time that it takes to change a movie reel. So you have a captive audience in a movie house, and you can give them a 4-minute speech, many of which were, they put out bulletins and newsletters and things that allowed people to craft speeches, or they would give them pre-published speeches so that in 4 minutes they could encourage them to buy Liberty bonds. There were 3 campaigns for Liberty bonds. They could encourage them to help the Red Cross efforts. Wilson actually, at one point, sends them an entire speech of his that they deliver wholesale to movie audiences. This does cause violence in some places when they go over their 4 minutes. And of course, the variation of speaker quality is huge. But they did use women in these efforts. The photos that I found of women are really, really interesting because there will be an entire group of men and 1 or 2 women. But the other place that they used them was at meetings of women's clubs, the theater matinees, where otherwise some of the 4 Minutemen would have been at work. And they're also figuring they're going to have a primarily female audience at that point. In some occasions, they did use the women in industrial shops where they were working, and just on street corners. One of the fun quotes that I found about this was a guy who said that you couldn't come across 3 people on a street corner without a 4-minute man coming up and giving a 4-minute speech. So, but the women were active in this group as well. The preparedness movement, and in particular Wilson, had a tremendous amount of support from Ladies' Home Journal, which at the time was being edited by Edward Bach. Bach had absolutely no use for the peace activists. And really, one of the things that you can trace in the magazines, if you don't just look at Ladies' Home Journal, is you can trace a shift from the peace movement where there's very much a protective mother-child kind of imagery, to this, which one of the theorists that I really love is Susan Zeiger, and she talks about this kind of image as now being an obedient, disempowered mother and a manly and aggressively patriotic son. So these are both from the cover, or both from, not the cover, but they're both from Ladies' Home Journal in 1917. So the image on the left, you can see this is definitely sort of the middle-class white mom sending her son gladly to, or at least graciously, if not gladly, to war. She's shorter than he is. Even though she's standing a step above him, she still has to go up on her toes. And he is already sort of out the door. He's looking to the distance. He's ready to serve his country. The Red Cross nursing uniforms I also find completely fascinating. And again, there's a collection. These are part of the Smithsonian collection. What do these remind anybody of? Nuns, yeah. They're very definitely made to look like habits. As I said before, there were about 10,000 American nurses who went overseas embedded with the military units. There were other women who went independently. The Red Cross in particular was concerned they were not that old at that point, they were not that well established, and they wanted the women in particular to wear these uniforms when they were off-site and they were out in the public. So the sort of nun habit makes them look very innocent, and it also gives people definitely a point of recognition that these are people attached to the Red Cross. The other thing that it did is it allowed for people to tell within camps who the actual Red Cross employees were versus sort of the old camp followers. You did have women who continued even in World War I to follow their men to battle, to do food preparation and nursing and things like that. So the Red Cross is trying to establish itself very much as a professional organization still at this point. They want the uniforms so that everyone looks similar. The white uniform kind of kills me because really, white blood, no. But you can see there's a darker one to the right as well, and the one in the middle of these three looks more to be a gray. But again, very modest and long-sleeved, but with the definite marker on it of the Red Cross. So Ladies' Home Journal continues to promote this. They also run lots of stories about mothers who are terribly sad but realize that they need to send their sons off to war and are willing to make that patriotic sacrifice for their country and for the good of other mothers that they may not have to do that. So this motherhood imagery continues to show up, and the motherhood message continues to be directed at them. And I don't want to imply that that's a positive or a negative thing. It was really what they felt they needed to do given that moment in time. They're also responding to, in part, trying to get these women involved to help the war effort. They're also trying to avoid the protests that they had during the Civil War when they introduced conscription. So when they first introduced conscription for the Civil War, there were actual riots, and they want to completely avoid that with World War I. So they're trying to get the women to say, you need to convince your sons to go, you need to convince your husbands that this is where they need to be, so that there will not be a violent reaction to that when they introduced the draft. And there really, in World War I, was less of a response to it than there was in the Civil War, which is kind of interesting. So these two groups do go after one another, which is kind of fun. The peace activists are ridiculed by the preparedness supporters as being naive and accused of putting everyone else's children in danger by not being prepared for the war. And this is one of my favorite quotes ever from the peace activists, who claim that knitting in response to war was a peculiarly infantile form of patriotism. So they do sort of go back and forth. We do have conflict that you see within families, of course. So Annie Catherine Graves, who is a very vocal member of the Women's Service Navy League, notes that it was maternal instinct that was her driving force, saying that a Navy second to none was the best hope for mothers for the safety of their sons and the safety of their country. At this particular time, her son is the secretary of the Collegiate Anti-Militarism League. So, even within families, you've got this kind of conflict. So she's talking about how you should send your son off to war, and her son is a very active war protester. The politicians also go after the peace activists. FDR says that women, who is at that time is the Secretary of the Navy, of course, he says that women's most important function is to urge men to enlist in the Navy. That is a much kinder notion than Teddy Roosevelt has. He says that the women who do not raise their boys to be soldiers when the country needs them are unfit to live in this republic. So, conflicting views. And of course, these are highly publicized words that come from these politicians. So one of the other really interesting conflicts shows up, I try not to go too far forward, with Kate Richards O'Hare, who is somebody that I think nobody's ever heard of. She is accused of saying that women were brood sows producing fertilizer for the fields of France. She denies using those exact words, but kind of even if she didn't use those exact words, you get her point. She repeatedly spoke out against Patriotic Motherhood, which she said was a labor contract in which women produce surplus labor in exchange for protection. She's a well-known pacifist and socialist, although she does wind up in prison with Emma Goldman, who has no use for her and calls her a total lightweight. But she repeatedly calls women's reproduction in service to the state into question. And of course, this is sort of a historic role for women during wartime, right, is to produce men to be soldiers. And she really critiques that and goes after it. She's arrested under the Espionage Act of 1917, which is an act that in part is still on the books today. It prohibits speech that interferes with military operations or recruitment. And she is given one of the longest sentences of anyone who is arrested under that act. There were about 200 people arrested, and about 20 of them were women. She is given the sentence of 5 years. And she repeatedly speaks to the press and goes after the press by saying, you're saying that I'm supposed to be a good and respectful mother, but you have put me in prison and taken me away from my children. So she's rhetorically very, very savvy. But she does serve her 5 years in prison. And again, is in prison with some women around her that she knows from the peace movement, like Emma Goldman. And Emma Goldman doesn't really appreciate her rhetoric. She says, this is not the way to do this. This is not the way to bring people to understand peace. So here is one of those images of this sort of protective mother. This was the cover sheet for I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier, where she is holding her son. So again, while you contrast that to the other image where she's sort of standing on the steps above him, this is, and kissing him to go off, this is much more of a connected relationship that's being portrayed here. My takeaway from this is that women are really, they're involved in less overt ways than we normally think, but they're also very vocal. They are publishing, they are speaking out, they're protesting on both sides. They are, and they're not united in any stance during World War I. And really, motherhood becomes very complicated as a rhetorical trope. And you really can't just reduce it and say that these people were all using maternal rhetoric. They definitely have some very distinct patterns in what they do, depending on which side they are on. And some of them switch sides. So they start out in the peace movement, and then again, like I said, they realize that we're at war and they want to support the war, so they move to the preparedness movement. They are also significantly used on both sides by Wilson and the government to put out their message, first of peace and then of support for the war. So I want to thank you guys very much for listening.